The honourable member for Elmwood-Transconna.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to address what I think are kind of two separate components of the motion today. One that has to do with the substantive question of a carbon tax and the role that such a price on carbon can play in helping us meet our climate change targets, and hopefully better targets than the ones we have, because unfortunately we still have the Harper government's climate change targets. That's item number one. And then item number two is the piece around transparency and accountability on the part of government when it comes to new measures. So on the first bit, I'd just like to say, I do support putting a price on carbon as part of an overall strategy to try and curb Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, because climate change is real and it's already having real consequences for Canadians. We've seen over the last number of years all sorts of instances where changing climate has led to different kinds of weather patterns that have caused natural disasters that have had serious consequences for Canadians and for people around the globe. We do have a government that has said it wants to be a climate leader, and that implies some real action. So fine if carbon pricing is part of that, but it can't be all of it. And it particularly can't be all of it in the kind of decentralized way that the Liberal government has decided to implement this price, where there is no guarantee that any of the revenue raised out of that price is going to be reinvested back into alternative energy or to the other kinds of things that we need to do to fight climate change. So it is a bit of a mystery to me how it is that the Liberal government believes that a price on carbon is going to make progress in terms of climate change when we're not taking the revenue raised from that, or even any guarantee of any portion of that revenue, to invest that back into cleaner energy, or things like retrofitting buildings, not just government buildings, but buildings in the private sector. Because these are ways not only that we can help reduce our emissions overall, and we need some initial capital in order to be able to get those projects going, but they're also ways that we can help create jobs as we make that transition to a cleaner economy. Retrofitting buildings, for instance, actually dollar for dollar produces more jobs for tradespeople than investments in traditional oil and gas infrastructure. We know that from an employment perspective, transit dollars are also extremely efficient in terms of the employment that they create, both in terms of building the actual infrastructure, the roads, but building the buses, having people drive the buses, and all of the positions that support a well-functioning transit system. So there are a lot of really excellent ways to both transition us to a cleaner economy, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and create jobs at the same time. But you really do need a plan. So my colleague earlier was referring to the idea of a legislated limit for greenhouse gas emissions. That has to be a key part of the plan. That's how you say, this is our target, and we're serious about it. In the absence of having a legislated limit on the amount of carbon you're going to produce, the plan for greenhouse gas emission reduction really is just kind of notional. It's a glaring lack of commitment, I would say, on the part of the government, that they're not willing to come out with a hard cap on emissions, because only then can you start to really get serious about making the investments that it's going to require in order to be able to bring greenhouse gas emissions down to that ceiling. So I do think that that's a critical part of the plan. I think if you have a plan, it is quite possible to create economic prosperity while reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, but unfortunately we're not there. I mean, that was the upshot of the report that was released just a few weeks ago by Canada's Auditors General, who said, really, if you look, it's not just the federal government, but many governments across the country just don't have a real plan when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to get on that. Part of that is a price on carbon, but there's a lot more that has to go with it in order for that to be effective and to make the cost worthwhile for Canadians who are going to be paying it. On the side of government accountability, I mean, I do agree with the gist of this motion that is saying there's no reason why, if you support a price on carbon, you shouldn't also support Canadians having the information about what that is going to cost. That's part about having a real and informed debate about the cost of these initiatives. It's part of having a good plan. I would say that the problem with the motion and what we've tried to fix with an amendment that I hope will pass is that it doesn't talk about the costs on the other side, but the costs of continuing to have rising greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't talk about, how much we think that this particular price on carbon is going to curb emissions and what the economic benefit of that would be. And so I would say that this is sometimes a particular kind of shortcoming or short-sightedness of some of my Conservative colleagues when we talk about many things. I would say that you see a similar short-sightedness when it comes to the conversation on pharmacare, where they want to stress how much it's going to cost, but they don't want to talk about the savings on the other side. So while they'll throw a number at you in terms of, the program's going to cost $18 billion or $22 billion, what they are not saying on the other side is that we're already spending far more than that. And actually, overall, we're going to save money. I think that kind of costing is also important. When we talked about childcare in the last election, we talked about having a national strategy. Conservatives and Liberals, in this case, were quick to point to the startup costs of such a program. But they weren't talking about the revenue the government was going to collect from income and payroll taxes, from parents, especially women, going back to work because they could afford it. They weren't talking about the increased revenue from sales taxes as parents spend that money in the local economy. And they weren't talking about the savings through other social programs that would be realized if parents, again, particularly mothers, could go back to work and support their families on the income from their work as opposed to the income from other programs. And when you put all of that costing together, it turns out that not only is the marginal cost of a national child care plan quite low, it may actually be able to pay for itself, not by some mystery or magic, not in the way the Prime Minister seems to think that the budgets would balance themselves, but in a costed way by economists who have looked at it and said that the potential to gain revenue out of something like this by having more people involved in the workforce actually counterbalances the cost. So we believe that if you're going to introduce innovative policy solutions that actually help solve a problem, whether it's increasing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change on the one hand, whether it's helping Canadians afford the cost of drugs, whether it's helping get parents back to work who want to be there with the National Child Care Strategy, what's important is that you actually look at the full costing. And it seems to me that that is an important principle of business, that business leaders would agree with that too. I'm sure business people, when they look at an investment, don't just look at the cost of the investment, they also look at potential return. And they weigh those things against each other, and they make good judgments. So the problem with this motion is that it asks for one side of the equation without asking for the other side of the equation. And in our view, that's not sufficient in order to be able to make a good judgment about carbon pricing. It's not just that we need to know what it's going to cost Canadians, although that's an important thing to know, and we want to know that, but we also want to know what the potential benefits and the potential cost savings over the long run. If we diminish the effects of climate change, what are we going to save in terms of mitigation costs? And how does all of that cash out? And we just think that's important for good decision making. So we're calling on our Conservative colleagues to appeal to their better selves and accept the full import of their instinct on this one, which is that if government is going to make a decision, Canadians should know the costs and they should also know the potential benefits. And that's why we're asking them to accept our amendment so that Canadians can get a costing not just of what they're going to pay in the carbon tax, but what the potential savings are going to be. And then we can look at those numbers and we can have an informed debate. And I think it's wrong to say we want the one information set, but we don't want the other information. That gives the impression that there's an underlying political agenda there, Mr. Speaker, which I'm sure is never the case here in the House, and certainly not the case with our Conservative colleagues. So I would call on them to put paid to that notion and support our amendment. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Speaker, you know, in working on the issue of price on pollution, the government has been very careful in terms of working with the different provincial entities in particular, along with territories. A part of this is saying that we have this system that's being put in place where the provinces will generate a significant amount of revenue. So depending on the province that you go to will determine in terms of how that could potentially impact the residents. So for example, you could have our home province. A member from Elmwood and I share the province of Manitoba, where we have a government that can say we want to invest that money that we're receiving back into X, whatever X might be. It could be for greener projects, it could be for cash in the pockets of the middle class, or whatever it might be. And I'm wondering if my colleague from across the way will give his thoughts in terms of what he believes Manitoba should be doing with the generation of the revenue that's going to be caused as a direct result of this particular price on carbon, because no doubt that would have an impact.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transconna.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I mean, obviously, I think it's important that if you're going to have a price on carbon, that some of that money be reinvested in working towards a cleaner economy. And I would say that it's part of the problem with the failure of leadership with the federal government, that they're leaving it open to governments like the Pallister government to totally disregard reinvesting in green infrastructure. Because if that's the case, it will defeat an important part of the point of putting a price on carbon.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Thornhill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my honourable colleague, as he always does, for providing some wise and reasoned counsel in debate. We certainly appreciate his support for the main thrust of our Conservative motion, which is to respond to the government that says climate change must be countered at all cost, but refusing to answer the question, the essential question of what that cost is. And indeed, in our previous Conservative government, when we regulated limitations on emissions by the major producers of these GHG emissions themselves, whether in the coal-fired industry or in the tailpipe emissions, which Canadians are still benefiting from today and will for the foreseeable future till the mid-2020s, we provided cost-benefit analysis. And I appreciate the member's suggestion that it is only logical that if we are going to look at the costs of the government's proposed program, which they resist to the moment, that eventually we would want to see the benefits as well. But the problem with this government, as you know, in recognizing their mistakes, their broken promises, in conceding the error of their ways, you have to proceed one correction of their course at a time. And the principal correction, I think, that Canadians want to know.
Order. 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 Just reserving a little bit of time left for a response. The honourable member for Elmwood-Transconna.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's unfortunate my colleague didn't quite get to the point where he could pose his question. He's quite right that in terms of the main thrust of the motion, I think there's something there. We need to be able to have an informed debate. But as I said in my remarks, I'm hoping that he and his colleagues will support our amendment, because I think that actually would allow us to have a real debate about the cost. And trying to talk about the cost of carbon pricing without talking about the potential benefits, not just to the planet, which is important and hard to put a price on, but also the real financial savings that can be had by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating climate change, I think is not a real debate yet.
And we do have a little bit of time left just for one more short question and response. The honourable member for Edmonton-Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Quick question. Our colleague from Timmins raised this point, but I think my member might be able to expand on this. The big issue here seems to be disclosure of information. Of course, this government promised to be open and transparent. Well, if this government would actually follow the advice that they're given when they travel to all these international meetings that the Commissioner complains about, they would listen to Britain, who in fact have come here several times to brief us. They actually have legislated their reduction targets. Every 5 years, those are up the ante on them. They've appointed an independent commission that not only advises on how to meet those targets, but provide an audit of how well that they have done and report that publicly. Does my colleague think that that kind of disclosure would be useful in this chamber as well?
For Elmwood-Transconna.
I absolutely do. I mean, I think that's part of what getting serious about climate change means. It's about establishing clear goals in legislation and then having the reporting mechanisms to follow up on it. And it's frankly just starting to get embarrassing having a government that talks so much about wanting to mitigate climate change but doesn't do the follow-through. I think it makes us look bad on the international stage, and it's a huge disappointment to Canadians that thought they were voting for a government that was actually going to do something but continue to get platitudes instead of concrete action. Other countries are showing the way. They're showing that you can make those reductions. Canada is not doing that. At some point, you got to evaluate the facts.